Welcome to the Heartbreak to Happiness Show with Sarah Davison. If you're struggling with a breakup and you feel shocked, angry, betrayed, devastated, or sad and alone, then this podcast is for you. Best-selling author and award-winning host Sarah Davison shares how you too can get on with your life to heal, grow, and move from heartbreak to happiness. Here's your host, Sarah Davison.
Welcome back to the show, and today my guest is Dr. Emma Katz. Now, Dr. Emma is an internationally renowned expert in domestic abuse and coercive control, and her work has influenced legislation in the US and overseas. Emma's research with mothers and children who have survived coercive control has transformed understandings of domestic abuse. Children's experiences of coercive control were largely invisible prior to Emma's work, which found that children were affected by many forms of abuse beyond physical violence against their mother, including imprisonment, deprivation of resources, and isolation from the outside world. Emma's research findings on children and coercive control have been used to train professionals internationally. She also has a book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives. So I am super excited to welcome Dr. Emma Katz to the show. Welcome, Emma. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you because I've been following your work for a long time. I'm blown away by how much you've achieved at such a young age. And I'm just super excited to share some of your knowledge with my listeners today, because I know this is a topic that resonates with so many people and is so much needed right now around the world. So first of all, would you like to introduce yourself a bit about the kind of work you do and maybe how you got into doing this?
Sure. So I'm a university professor and I have written the book Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, which has just been published by Oxford University Press. And I'm very excited about, hopefully this book is going to make an impact. Survivors have already been telling me that they found it really validating, and it's been as though it's been written about their life almost, and it's brought a lot of clarity to what they've been through. But I'm also hoping it's going to have impacts on policy and the way that professionals are treating survivors, because at the moment we're not always getting that right at all. So yeah, I first got into this as a Ph.D. student, and I was wanting to do a PhD. I was looking for a topic, and somebody suggested I read a book called Children's Perspectives on Domestic Violence, which I did, and I was blown away by this book because it explained how we're getting things so wrong when it comes to children and domestic abuse, because we're imagining that children are passive victims, voiceless victims. We have this whole imagery of them as perhaps sort of sitting, clutching their teddy bears in a dark corner, or perhaps we imagine that they're not even affected by it at all. But what we're not understanding is that children are very harmed, not just by witnessing physical violence, but by everything that's going on that the abuser's doing in the home, which extends far beyond just their violence. But also children are actively coping with it. They are planning and strategizing how to cope, and they are finding ways of surviving. And one point that the book made that I thought was excellent was that when adults ignore the children in the scenario and they imagine that the children don't need to talk about it and it's best to just not say anything, children hate that. They end up feeling doubly disadvantaged. First, they've been through this very traumatic experience, and then no one will talk to them about it. No one will take them seriously as people with knowledge of what has happened, because this is happening in their life. This is their life that is being affected. So that really switched me on to thinking about the experiences of children who've been through domestic abuse. But one thing that was really missing was I felt we weren't understanding how children were affected by coercive control, the coercive control of the abuser. How was that affecting the children across multiple different domains of their life? And that's what I wanted to start exploring myself, and that's what my own book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, is about.
I mean, it's extraordinary, because what you're saying is absolutely spot on, and just follows my experience with so many clients going through this with their partners and their children. Talking there about coercive control, it's obviously a big topic right now. What specifically do you mean by coercive control, Emma?
Yeah, so I see coercive control as foundational to the most serious kind of domestic abuse. So everything that a coercively controlling domestic abuser is doing, they are doing with the motivation and the purpose of getting control of another person or persons, usually their partner and sometimes also their children, and keeping that control for as long as they want it, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. And everything that they're doing is motivated by that desire to entrap you and get control of you. So the psychological abuse, that's part of their attempt at controlling you, manipulating you, making you doubt your own sanity, making you feel badly about yourself, making you feel worthless. All of that is to destabilize you and make you feel like you're not worthy of anything better, so that they can get control of you. The economic abuse, controlling how much money you have, not allowing you to build up assets in your own name, creating a lot of debt that you're liable for. All of that economic abuse is also to entrap and control you, because when you're entrapped, obviously you can't break free of their control. The sexual coerciveness is to further control and humiliate you, and also sadly to display how much control they have over you. And image-based abuse, threatening to share images of you, all of that is again all about controlling you. So to me, coercive control is foundational to everything the abuser's doing, and all the different tactics they're using, including, I must say, sometimes being nice to you, which is a crucial tactic of perpetrators, because if they kept this horrible behavior up 24/7, it would push you to escape from them. In order to keep you entrapped for the maximum amount of time, they have to throw in periods of nice behavior, caring behavior, gift giving, because that gives you false hope. It makes you think things can't be that bad, think it can't be as bad as I've imagined, it's got better now, this is okay now, I can stay. So that is also part of the entrapment and the control, that the nice periods are never real. But yeah, everything the abuser's doing, controlling where you can go, what you can do, who you can see, how you can dress, how you can appear, what opinions you can express, what tones of voice you can use, everything that they're controlling, that's all part of their coercive control. The coercion bit is very interesting, because we're talking about more than just someone being extremely controlling. We're talking about control coupled with the presence of credible threat, and the coercion is created by the presence of credible threat. The abuser has established with you over a period of time that if you disobey them, if you displease them, if you don't cooperate with what they want from you, they will do something to you in punishment that is profoundly upsetting to you. So it might be hitting you, or it might be going cold and silent and not speaking to you for hours, which is very distressing for you. Or it might be ranting and raving at you, or it might be spending your very much needed money to that you need to pay the rent on something frivolous. It might be upsetting the children and ruining their upcoming event. Whatever it is they know will really upset you, they will do that if you disobey, and you know from experience that they will do that if you disobey. So you stop disobeying, and your world gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, because the only thing you can do in the end is what they will allow you to do. The only choice you can make is, what can I do that won't anger them? So we're talking about the survivor. They've become entrapped. Their whole space for action, their whole life is no longer their own. They're not able to make their own choices anymore. Everything is dictated by the perpetrator's desires and wants.
Wow, I mean, that's going to resonate with so many people listening. I just know, I mean, that's a great description and explanation about what is coercive control, because you're right, it's all encompassing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people talk about domestic abuse within a relationship being between the perpetrator and then the other parent, maybe in this scenario with children. But you touched on the fact that domestic abuse affects children as well. And this isn't always sort of shown through the family court system. In fact, quite often children's voices are ignored. So what are the challenges that you're seeing right now that are the biggest issues, you think?
Well, yeah, as I said a minute ago, everything that the abuser is doing will be affecting the children. So say most often we see this play out with a heterosexual couple and the abuser is the male and the survivor is the female. However, in a small percentage of cases, we do see it the other way around, and it can also happen in LGBT relationships as well. But I'll just go with the scenario that's most common, which is male abuser and female survivor and children survivors. So everything that the father in the family is doing is affecting the children. So if the mum has become isolated because every time she goes out, he interrogates her, he accuses her of having affairs, she's become very isolated in order to avoid all that interrogation, then the children can't go out as much. If they're young, if they're under 10, say, if mum can't take them to their friend's house on a day out to the park because she'll get interrogated because of the backlash when she gets home, the children aren't going. So their world becomes very small and isolated as well. If the abuser likes things to be exactly his own way in the home, then the children can't do messy play, they can't run around, they can't shout. They're having to constantly monitor the abuser's mood as well, just like the adult victim and survivor is. So what I say in my book is that the adult victim and the child victim are co-victims. And similarly, they're co-survivors because they're victims and they're survivors. So I call the adult victim and the child victims co-victims and co-survivors because they're both experiencing exactly the same thing. They're both being harmed by it, and they're both trying to figure out ways to survive it and having to adapt and strategize as best they can in the face of this malevolent regime of coercive control. And in terms of challenges, I think you're spot on that the family court so often does not remotely understand what the abuser has done to the children and why they are an unsafe and unsuitable parent. And it ends up with the survivor parent, most often a protective mum, being punished by the family court for trying to keep their own child safe. And that is a massive international problem that myself and other researchers are very well aware of. And we're doing the best we can with that and trying to shed light on how this is playing out and why it's so harmful and destructive. And we are doing our best to highlight all of this.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are doing phenomenal work. It's something that is a big bugbear of mine. I mean, it's horrific what is happening and what I've witnessed. It's just really not, you just wouldn't believe these things are happening in today's society with the way things are, that victims can be blamed like that. And like you say, the word punished is so true. Punished for protecting your child. I mean, it doesn't sound possible. So for those of you listening and thinking, well, that sounds odd, this is happening. It is a real problem.
It is happening. And not only is it happening now, it's been happening for the last 20 to 30 years. This is a long-term problem in the family court, and it has harmed so many families. In the United States, it's estimated that at least 58,000 children are taken from safe parents and placed in the custody of abusive parents every year.
I mean, that's just, it just begs belief. I mean, where is the sanity? I mean, sometimes it's like, I mean, I've described it myself as being the only sane person in a lunatic asylum when you go into that family court system, because, where children are refused a voice. I mean, this is something that I just think is incredible. I mean, I've seen this in cases all over the world where, victims of abuse are trying to protect their child, or their child has signs that they are scared to spend time with the other parent. And, that's been turned on to the victim as if it's them. And maybe they've used that awful term, parental alienation, which, is just horrendous as well. But, that they've turned the child against the abuser, when actually this is a natural reaction from any child who's been in an abusive situation. So this is something
children tend to react quite variably in domestic abuse situations. Some of them side with the abuser and they've strategized that that's their best chance of survival. Some of them end up pretty confused and in a very confused, anxious state because they're not sure how to feel. And some of them very clearly do not like the abuser, are scared of the abuser, have a very realistic view of just how destructive the abuser is. They get it. They see that the abuser is abusive. They have got it. And it is those children who are particularly suffering in the family court, because, as you say, no one will listen to their voice. And when they say, I have good reason for being scared of my abusive parents, and I have good reason for not wanting to see them, the children are often told, well, that's not really your voice. Someone's put that idea in your head, which is so awful. And then they're left unheard, and they've been let down by systems that should have protected them. And then we end up in a situation where children are simply not allowed to leave their abuser. So obviously with the adult victim, we encourage these days for the adult victim to leave the abuser. But when the child, who, remember, is a co-victim and a co-survivor of that abuser, tries to leave their abuser, the family court very often says, no, you're not allowed to. You must continue to spend time with your abusive parent, who of course is continuing to abuse the child in most cases, because coercive controllers don't stop when you at the point where you leave them. In fact, they usually escalate at the point where you leave them.
Yeah, so true. I think a lot of victims of abuse that I've worked with anyway, obviously will try and protect their children from the abuse, and sometimes feel that, well, I'm protecting, my child doesn't see me upset. My child, I've always got a happy face on, or I do my best not to let it show, or to argue in front of them, or to agree with the perpetrator, so that, I manage the situation when my child's around. But, I've seen that the damage that it can still do, because children pick up on this and they're very aware. Is this something that you see?
Absolutely. I think the protective parent will have so many strategies to try and make the children as safe and okay as possible within the constraints of what they can do while they're being subjected to coercive control. And often they can't do as much as they want to do to make the children safe and okay, but they're doing everything that they can do. And sometimes that does involve putting on a happy face and trying to get the children to not know what's happening. But as you say, children are very sensitive to what's happening. They know. And one of the mothers in my book, for example, she described how the abuser would be out at work, and then around the time he was due home, the atmosphere would change. She had 2 little girls, they'd all be playing happily, and then suddenly they'd all go very still and quiet, and they just knew that his arrival was imminent. And there were all these unspoken rules about what these little girls could and couldn't do, because whatever you did, you couldn't upset daddy. So the children were very aware of what was happening, even though mum was doing huge amounts to try to keep them as safe and okay as possible. And very often this particular abuser, who's very Jekyll and Hyde with them, which is quite often the case, when he wanted to spend time with them, he expected them to switch into being very affectionate and very loving children with him, and have carefree, fun playtime with him. But when he wasn't in the mood for them, then he would not tolerate them at all. And at those points, he expected them to shut up, be quiet, blend into the wallpaper, and not speak up about their needs, which is obviously a very unnatural and harmful thing for a child. And so these 2 little girls were constantly trying to work out what version of themselves daddy wanted them to be that day, that hour, that minute, and were, like I say, hyper vigilant and monitoring of the perpetrator's moods. So even with the mum doing so much to try and make them as safe and okay as possible, they were so aware of how volatile and how Jekyll and Hyde the abuser could be, and they were doing their best to adapt to it. One of the little girls had a real speech delay. She wasn't speaking at all really until the age of 3, and that was after the mother had separated. And I think some people will put that down to the trauma of having witnessed violence, although she didn't witness very much violence, because this abuser was highly controlling but not very often violent. But I think it was something else. I think that she felt it was too dangerous to speak, because she couldn't. She felt like it was, what if she got it wrong and she said the wrong thing, and then daddy was upset, and then the negative reaction. So it was just safer to keep completely quiet and not say anything at all, rather than take that risk of speaking and angering him. I think that's why she wasn't speaking, even at 3 years old.
Wow. I mean, I agree. I think, we learn to adapt, and children are very resilient, I think, and from working with mostly mums going through these sort of dilemmas with their children, children do adapt, and they find ways to cope. And when they're away at the perpetrator's home, spending time with them, again, they develop their own sort of safety mechanisms and not speaking, and learning to sort of walk on eggshells, to the point where they can sort of sense things coming. And I guess, it's our job, I feel, I mean, as parents, but also as as a coach from where I'm standing, and you as an expert helping people and informing people of all this really amazing education you've put into your book, is how do we best support our kids, and what tools can we give them to cope better? Because when you're working in a system which many times is appearing to be against you because you're not believed, your voice isn't heard and your child isn't, what can you control? Because if you do focus all your energy on, well, this report is inaccurate or untruthful, or people aren't listening to me, or there doesn't seem any way for me to put my case across and have it listened to without me being judged negatively for having that opinion, how do you cope? Because it feels sometimes like there is no way through. I think for me, the way through is to take your power back over what you can control, and giving your kid coping strategies to manage, sort of, and actually acknowledging, I know you're doing a really good job when you're there. Everything you're doing is right. Even though you don't know exactly what they're doing, it kind of relieves some of the pressure for them, because in their little head, they're sort of doing all these things and maybe you're not around at that time, but just giving them that reassurance can help. What do you think, and what ideas do you have to sort of support kids going through that? Hi, it's Sarah Davison here, the divorce coach. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Heartbreak to Happiness. I just wanted to let you know about a free gift I've got for you, which I know will help you if you're struggling with your breakup or divorce right now. I'd like to offer you a free week's membership of my Heartbreak to Happiness online support group sessions, with unlimited access to any of the groups during this time. So what are they? Well, these are friendly and confidential online support groups run by my accredited coaches. I've designed them to ensure that you're not alone, and there is help and support out there to help you cope better. One delegate, Jane, said after her first session, "I can't believe how much better I feel in just 1 hour." Another delegate, Wendy, said, "My friends and family are so fed up of hearing me talk about this, and now I finally feel like I've found my tribe." I've designed these sessions so you'll meet other people going through similar situations, and you'll be able to share your story in a safe space. My specialist coaches are all trained personally by me and are there to offer support and help to enable you to dial down those negative emotions and let go of your ex. So I wanted to make a special offer to all my podcast listeners, which is a 3 weeks access to this unique support. It means that you will have access to as many support sessions as you would like to attend in a week, and we've got lots of days and different times to choose from. This is a great way to start to take your power back and help you feel more empowered. Remember, as I always say, it's not what happens to you that defines you, it's what you do about it that makes you the person you are. So sign up now at www.sarahdavison.com/support group. That's sarahdavison.com/support group to claim your free gift and to move from your heartbreak to happiness. Even though you don't know exactly what they're doing, it kind of relieves some of the pressure for them, because in their little head, they're sort of doing all these things and maybe you're not around at that time, but just giving them that reassurance can help. What do you think, and what ideas do you have to sort of support kids going through that?
I completely agree. And it's so tough for protective parents, protective mums, because what you really need to be able to do is protect them from this ongoing contact, and you can't because it's family court ordered. So you have to send them off, and it's harming them, and you have to do your best to mitigate those harms as best you can, as you say. And I think that protective mums are very good at doing that, and they are a lifeline for their children. And one thing that I did find in the book, which was based on interviews with 15 mums and 15 of their children, 30 in total, was that some mums really had successfully steered their children through those childhood years of quite harmful contact with the abuser, but the children had entered their teenage years. Yes, they've been harmed, but they were still pretty well functioning, and it had not done as much harm as it might have done. And that was because of the protective mum, because she had managed to mitigate some of those impacts, which, by the way, she should never be in the position of having to do in the first place, if only the systems would actually protect the child. But that's the situation that she is left in. And I think telling them that they're doing a good job, that's a great idea. I love that. And also remember that the abuser will not want the child to express their real, authentic self. They will want the child to be the version of the child that is acceptable to the abuser. And that will not be the child's authentic self. So the child will constantly having to be presenting a different version of themselves when they're around the abuser in order to try and keep them happy. So when they're with you, try and keep reinforcing to them that their real self, you like it, and other people like it, and it's okay and it's good, and keep giving them opportunities to express their real, authentic self. And anything that's a bit of a creative outlet, like anything that you can get them to do around, movement, dance, drama, sport, to give them an outlet for their emotions, that's very helpful. Try and get as many other protective adults into their life as possible, so that you're counterbalancing somewhat the influence of the abuser, and quite possibly the abuser's family, who are often also very problematic relatives for the child. So try and bring in your own friends and your own family if they're okay, and so you're surrounding the child with protective adults. And just keep reinforcing to the child how much you like them, and try and give them general lessons on healthy behavior, boundaries. Obviously, protective mums can't always directly address the abuser's treatment of the child and say the way that the abuser's treated you is wrong, because if that gets back to the family court, you'll be accused of parental alienation, which you shouldn't be, but you will be. So you kind of have to tiptoe around it, but try and give them general lessons on boundaries, healthy behavior. If there's something on TV or something on YouTube that they've been watching, try and engage them in a discussion about healthy behavior, consent, boundaries, all of that, so that the messages start getting into the child. And hopefully by the time they get to their teenage years, they'll be able to ease up on contact, because the court will listen to them. Most of the time the courts tend to listen to middle teenagers a bit more than they do younger children, although not always. But by the time they get into their mid-teens and their young adulthood, hopefully they'll have a good sense of themselves and how they should be treated, and they will start to be able to see that the way the abuser treated them is not the right way to be treated, that they shouldn't have been treated like that, and that they shouldn't treat anyone else like that either.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, boundaries and consent, I think, are key. I think one of the ways that I work with clients is to encourage just contrast, because obviously you can't say anything negative, like you say, because that's going to be used against you if that was ever to come out. Mm-hmm. And also maybe it's not the right approach anyway, because then it sort of sets you against the other parent, and it's about working with your child rather than setting you and them apart, I think. But the contrast effect of sort of saying, in our house there's no shouting, there's no arguing, there's no bullying, just those, kindness is key here. Kindness, and then, like you say, if there's a movie or a YouTube video, or you see something in the street that's kind, reinforcing the empathy and seeing those emotions and encouraging that, I think, are key. And that can work very successfully. I've seen that work many times, and I think it's difficult for so-called experts in the family court to say anything about that, other than that's a positive way forward. Although they can find their ways, we know that. But what you were saying earlier about the sort of not being able to be your authentic self as a child, I think a lot of people listening who are in these scenarios will resonate with the fact that children then sometimes find it difficult to be with mum and dad in the same place at the same time. So whether that's a school event or pickups, or actually spending time with the both of them, which quite often can be enforced by so-called court experts or the family court themselves, the parents have to spend time together, which again is, as you said earlier, for a victim of abuse, we would encourage no contact. But in these cases, the abuse is quite often ignored, and the victim is blamed for high conflict, which is a whitewash, in my opinion, for this is a victim of abuse. But anyway, that's the term that's freely used to enable that to continue. So I think a lot of people say, well, they don't like it. My child is strange when we're together. They're not themselves, but that's obviously because they are two different people. They're not themselves when they're there. So actually trying to be with two people, thinking, well, hang on, you know me as this person, and then the safe parent, yeah, but you know me as me. It's very difficult, isn't it? How do you address that with the child so that it becomes conscious maybe for them? Is that a good idea, so that they can sort of understand themselves? And at what age is that a good idea to start broaching with them?
Gosh, nobody's ever asked me that question before, and I'm not entirely sure I know the answer. I think it might be a good idea. I think it very much depends on the child and how receptive they would be to that. And obviously children mature at different rates. So, sometimes you find an 11-year-old who's more like a 14-year-old and vice versa. But yeah, I think that as it feels appropriate to bring that up, if it does, then I think that could be a good strategy, because a lot of what the child will have done, they will have done fairly unconsciously, and it might not have been brought to their attention. So they've had to create all sorts of strategies to cope and manage. And I think often, when we've been through a lot of trauma, it's about creating a narrative around that emphasizes our strengths, so that we can recognize that we do have strengths and that we aren't just victims of circumstance, as much as that can be the case sometimes. So for children, I think it's about reinforcing with them a positive narrative of, look how resourceful you are, look how strong you are, that you have found ways to navigate this very tricky situation, and I'm really proud of you for that, and that strength and that resourcefulness and that adaptability, you can harness that in the future in ways that are going to be so helpful for you in your future life, as well as in the present and the past. So just trying to construct a more positive narrative that's empowering for the child, so they recognize their strengths, because they will have had enormous strength to cope with and survive what they've been through.
I mean, you're spot on. I think you're reinforcing those strengths, their positives, what they're good at, again, because they're probably not going to get that at the perpetrators, because that's not how they work. I suppose it becomes normal though, doesn't it? If you're not highlighting that this isn't normal, then they're going to think that is what a parental relationship is like, with that, that's normal. And I guess that's the trap do they fall into, like you said before, either becoming more like the perpetrator because that's the way to survive, becoming a victim, or just going, I don't want anything to do with this, I see it and I don't want to have anything to do with it, which probably is the healthiest option for a child, because it's the conscious awareness that gives them the ability to say that isn't okay. And I suppose it's at what point is that possible to sort of show them, gosh, that isn't normal behavior. But I've seen, by having, as you suggested, good role models, other, if it's male role models, if it's their dad, or if it's their mum, a female role model, but other healthy relationships where, for example, teachers at school, if there is a really sort of healthy relationship with a teacher at school, then maybe they'll learn, gosh, no, not all men are like that at that age. Not all men treat me in that way. Other people treat me differently. So it's sort of contrast, compare, and learning, rather than being, sitting down and having that conversation, which again could be used against you as a parent. It's a fine line, right?
It's a very fine line, and survivors have already been through so much, and now they're having to do these mental gymnastics. I can't stress enough how unfair this is. And like I say, what we're doing here is I saw this wonderful graphic the other day of a bridge with a huge gap in it, and people were falling off the bridge and into a river. And what we're doing right now is we're trying to fish people out downstream, especially children. We're trying to fish them out of the river of having to keep the abuser in their life and hoping that they haven't drowned in the meantime. But we're not fixing the bridge, that has the big hole in it, which is the family court. Just every single, so often allowing the abuser to keep control by keeping in contact with the children, because I know here in the UK, less than 2% of family court decisions are orders for no contact, and yet it was estimated that in the UK family court, 62% of their cases are domestic abuse cases. So 62% of domestic abuse cases, less than 2% are resulting in orders of no contact. That is the abuser getting contact with the children almost every single time. So we need to fix that upstream. We need to fix this problem. And at the moment, all we can do is try and fish the children out of the river and hope that or throw them life rafts and hope that they don't drown while they're in it, which is not satisfactory and it's not okay. But like I say, protective mums are really good at doing that. They just shouldn't ever have to be.
That's a really powerful analogy of fishing them out later down the line and hoping they haven't drowned or severely, damaged by the time you do. But why is this happening in the family court? Why is there this gap, and how is it continuing? Where do you see the challenges? Is it lack of awareness? Is it a corrupt system? Is it the so-called experts? Is it that the lawyers are making too much money, and so these kind of I've seen a lot of the parental alienation, I don't really like that term, but that argument used in court, weaponized to make a lot of money from clients. The experts, I'm saying, if you're watching on YouTube, in inverted commas, because they're far from that, and that's just me being nice right now. But where does this come from, and how is it sort of able to continue?
I think it's everything that you just said, plus also a big dose of sexism. I think that family courts are making too much money from allowing the abuser to come back to court over and over and over again, dragging the survivor parent back 30 times in 5 years. That shouldn't be allowed in the first place, but it's making far too much money for people. And I think sometimes there is corruption, because I think sometimes there's corruption in every system. I think there's a lot of sexism still. I think that women's are still often viewed as hysterical, manipulative, vindictive, the classic sexist stereotypes around women. And a man's word is seen as more reliable, honest, stable, trustworthy than a woman's. Again, these have been stereotypes that have been around for a few thousand years, and it's not surprising that they're still there. I think that the family court hasn't caught up with the idea of children's voices being important, which I think has become an increasingly strong idea in the last 30 years within society, but in the family court it's still not really there. And I think that, well, having said that, no, I think when the children say they want to see the perpetrator, then that can be seized upon as, yes, we're listening to the children and allowing them to see the perpetrator. But when the children saying that they don't, that's when their voice is no longer listened to and is seen as somehow corrupted. This isn't really their real voice. They don't know what they're talking about. And also, I think the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that the courts have an overwhelming pro-contact culture. They are not there to deal with child abuse, and a coercive controller has abused their children. Coercively controlling your household is a form of child abuse, in my opinion, and the book explains why in some detail. So the family courts are not set up to deal with child abuse. They don't see it as their purpose. They see it as an annoying distraction from what they want to do, which is get both parents to continue to see the children. So they have a very strong pro-contact culture. They want both parents to stay in the child's life. Although, interestingly, a child can be dragged kicking and screaming and protesting to see a parent they don't want to see, and that's fine. But I've never seen a parent dragged kicking and screaming by the police to sit with their child when the parent doesn't want to do that. So the child, I think that we still have the idea that it's all right to dominate children that way, to force them to do things against their wishes, but we don't think that that's acceptable behavior towards an adult. So I think that there's a real double standard there around how we're willing to treat children and adults. So I think there's a lot of things that are wrong.
Personally campaign on, personally find abhorrent, and will never stop until that is eradicated, because it's utterly unacceptable in every way. And it's child abuse by the police, it's child abuse and abuse of the mother, all that. It's just, I could talk to you for hours, Emma, because there's so much here. I just do want to bring up, I know it's been trending a little bit on Twitter, the hashtag unregulated experts. This is something that has been, finally there is a light being shone. There's been an article in The Guardian, The Observer recently in the UK. shining a light on the fact that judges are putting a lot of reliance on so-called experts, which I strongly disagree with the word, but that's what they're called, who are, writing reports to say that children should be removed from the mothers, and that there is, this parental alienation argument coming up many times in some of those reports. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that there were problems with both the regulated and unregulated experts, because even when they're regulated, the mechanisms for holding them to account are so weak and so time consuming that they're not effective. So I think there needs to be a heck of a lot more accountability, swift, effective accountability built into the system, so that the so-called experts are having to think a lot more carefully about what they're doing. In terms of parental alienation, I again, I could talk about that for a good couple of hours, so I'll try and keep that brief. But what we need to understand is that the notion of parental alienation syndrome was invented in the 1980s by a self-published man called Richard Gardner, who had a number of extremely concerning views. And he came up with the idea. This wasn't being talked about very much before him. And some of his concerning views, he said, there's a bit of paedophilia in everyone. He said that, that there's nothing really wrong with paedophilia, and we're just making too much of a fuss about it as a society. We've become too hysterical about it. We need to calm down. The children wouldn't actually be negatively affected by it if we weren't being so hysterical. And there's a video of him being asked, what should a mother say to a child if the child comes to the mother and says, "Daddy's abusing me"? And he smiles in the video and he says, the mother should say, "How dare you say that about your father? And if you say that again, I'll beat you." So that's the father of parental alienation, Richard Gardner. And this was in the 80s. And what Gardner did was he took parental alienation syndrome theory that he'd come up with around the family courts in America and got custody for many, many fathers whose children were saying, "Dad sexually abused me." And he got custody for these fathers. And that is the purpose of that whole concept. And today it still has that same impact, where Professor Joan Meyer did a very good comprehensive study of what's going on in the United States of America in 2019, and you can Google it, it's freely available online, Professor Joan Meyer. And what she found was that when a mother is telling the family court that the father has been abusive of her or of the children, if the father then counters that, "No, I haven't, but she's alienated me from the children," he's overwhelmingly likely to get custody of the children. If he says that, the court don't even need to believe him. He only even needs to say it with no evidence. Obviously, the children are saying they don't want to see him, so that is evidence that he's been alienated. But of course, they may not want to see him for extremely good reasons, like he's been abusing them. So what Meyer found was that his claim that he's been alienated was taken more seriously than the mother's claim that he'd been abusive, systematically, and that most of the time it differed by different scenarios. It depended on exactly what the mother was saying the father had done. For example, if she was saying that he'd sexually abused the children, that was particularly likely to backfire on her, and he was particularly likely to get custody if she'd said sexual abuse compared to if she'd said domestic violence. It really did seem from the Meyer study like the worse or serious with the accusation or perceived seriousness of the accusation, the more likely he was actually to win custody, very disturbingly. And so this is the way that parental alienation functions in the family court. If you're a father who's accused of abusing your partner or your child, you say you've been alienated, you really increase your chances of getting custody of the children. Not every single time, but you really increase your chances. On the other hand, if you flip it around and you have a father saying a mother has been abusive and a mother counterclaiming, "Well, no, I haven't been abusive, but you've alienated me," the mothers were far less likely to get custody from the courts. It was gender biased. This was working for the fathers at high rates, not working for the mothers at high rates, hardly working for them at all. So it's very gender biased. Now, having said all that, is it true that when a parent is coercive controller, do they sometimes turn the children against the survivor parent? Yes, they do. Absolutely. But I don't think we should be calling that parental alienation, because that is playing into the hands of this concept that does a lot of harm to survivors, adult survivors and child survivors. I think we need to address it, sure, but I think we don't. For me, I don't call it parental alienation. If a survivor parent has found that their children have been turned against them by a domestic abuse perpetrator, I would say that is parent-child relationship sabotage as part of coercive control. And I know that's a little bit longer and more cumbersome than just this saying PA, but that's what I would call it. I would say that the coercive controller has sabotaged the parent-child relationship, or usually the mother-child relationship, but occasionally the mother-child relationship. And they've done it as part of their coercive control. They've sabotaged that relationship as part of their isolation tactics, because they're not only isolating you from your friends and your own parents and your own siblings, but they're also isolating you from your own children. It's part of the psychological abuse tactics, you know, to make you feel down and depressed and like you can't get anything right because now your children hate you and won't listen to you. It's part of the coercive control. I think it needs to be addressed as part of the coercive control.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it is abuse, and that it falls into that. And you know, I have clients who've been through that and are going through that, and I know people listening will be going through that, and it's horrific. It's you know, again, it's the most painful of abuse when you can sort of try to or harm that bond between, you know, a parent and a child. It's awful, and I think, you know, that is part of what we all campaign for too. It's, you know, it stands together under that abuse umbrella, but again, we can't get those confused, because it's, yeah, it lets them off the hook by applying that same language. It's very complicated. It's a very fine line. It is utterly horrific and shocking what is happening in family courts around the world. And, you know, I'm a big fan of yours, Emma, cheering you on all the way, because I think this message needs to get out there. And I'm delighted you came on as my guest today. How can people find you if they want to follow you and find out more about your work?
Sure. So I'm very active on Twitter, and just at the time of saying this, I've got about 16,000 Twitter followers, but obviously that'll get out of date quite quickly. So feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Emma Katz, so Dr. Emma Katz. Katz is spelled Katz. So follow me on Twitter. That's the best way. I do also have an Instagram account, Emma Katz Ph.D, and I'm on LinkedIn. My book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, has a Facebook page. So I've tried to kind of get a presence on various different platforms. Survivors do contact me really frequently, often because I think they want to tell somebody what's happened who understands and who gives them a validating response, who believes them, and sometimes they want practical advice, and I don't always know the answer, but sometimes I do know someone I can signpost them to. But yeah, I think it's so tough for survivors out there, because not only have you been through the abuse, but then all the systems that are supposed to protect you have probably let you down. And so that is enough to drive anyone to absolute despair. But what I would say is there are people who do believe you, and in my Twitter community, it's full of survivors. We all, you know, everyone believes each other, supports each other. It's a really nice forum for airing your feelings and what you've been through, and getting it heard and getting it validated by other people who understand. And I would also say, even if 100 people don't understand what you've been through, and you seem to be the only one on the planet who understands what's happened, you are still right. Your truth is still the truth, even if nobody else has the skills or the expertise or the knowledge to understand what's happened and believe it. So stand firm in your truth. You know what's happened, and nothing can change that from being the truth, even if several dozen people do not get it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it's not true. It is true.
Wow, powerful, empowering words, Emma. Thank you so much. I have one last question for you that I ask all my guests. My podcast is called Heartbreak to Happiness, and I think it's really important to know what happiness is for you. So even if you are listening to this and resonating strongly with all the things that Emma has said, you know, that you can tap into happiness along the way. So what is happiness for you, Emma?
Well, I think, can I reframe that slightly and say, what does happiness look like in the aftermath of coercive control? Absolutely. And I think one thing that's really unique about my book is that it looked at the long-term trajectories of people who'd escaped from coercive control several years earlier and what it had taken to recover. And several of the mums and the children had got to a place where they had developed really happy, healthy mother-child relationships with each other. They talked about being there for each other. They had a strong sense that they were there for each other, that they would support each other. They felt really loved and validated and supported by each other. And this hadn't happened overnight. And sometimes this has taken years to unfold. And there'd been a lot of pain and there'd been a lot of misunderstanding to work through in the early stages. But once the difficulties of the coercive control had been worked through, often with therapeutic help, perhaps through a domestic abuse organisation. That's here in the UK, for example, there's some mother-child relationship recovery programmes that are run, such as up in Scotland, CEDAR, and the NSPCC runs a programme called DART, Domestic Abuse Recovering Together. So anything like that, I think, is if you can get yourself onto one of them, that really helps. Or getting a good counsellor or psychotherapist for you and your child that actually understands coercive control. Ask them before you hire them. Ask them if they understand it. And if you're not satisfied with their answer, find someone else, because so often they don't understand. You have to screen them. But yeah, once they'd worked through the difficulties, and often that took a while, their relationships did evolve into very close and supportive relationships in many cases, and they were really happy in those relationships. They were working really well. And one girl, it's the closing quote of my book, she explains that since they've broken free of the coercive controller and he was no longer a big presence in their lives, I'm not saying he was no presence, because he was still lurking about in the background somewhere, but he was no longer a day-to-day presence. They had a lot more freedom to do what they wanted to do. And she explained that, she said, we used to be all dull and we didn't like life much. And now we're all happy. She was meaning her and her little brother and her mum. She said, we're all happy. We can do what we want to do. And I think that's so powerful. That freedom of choice is so important to happiness. You can't be happy when you have no freedom of choice. I think that freedom to just choose the commonplace direction of your own life, to decide how you're going to do your hair that day, if you're going to take your kids to the beach, if you're going to take them to the park, who you're going to speak to that day, if you want to call a friend, that you feel free to call them, how you feel free to spend as much time on the phone with them as you want. These commonplace choices, that these are the things the coercive controller takes away from us. Getting that back is so important. And as you mentioned earlier, reclaiming your power, reclaiming the things that you do have power over, that's so important. And remember, the abuser, they're going to be happy in some senses, but they're never really going to be happy in the way that healthy people are going to be happy, because everything that they've got through deception and manipulation is very inauthentic, and it's not come from a healthy place at all. Whereas survivors have the opportunity to really achieve happiness from a place that is healthy. They have an opportunity to be loved, because they are so lovable, because they are good people, so for the most part. So I think that's really important to hang on to, that survivors do have the chance for real happiness in a way that the abuser will never have, because it's just a whole different kettle of fish.
Oh, what a wonderful answer. It's so true. Adversity can make you stronger. And when you felt those real lows, as any victim of abuse will have done, it enables you, when you're through that, to an extent, to feel those true highs. And I think that's, you can really appreciate that happiness and that freedom that you had, as you mentioned. So Emma, wow, so powerful, such wise words. I could talk to you for many more hours, but unfortunately we have to say goodbye. But thank you, Emma, so much for being such a fabulous guest.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I really hope this has been helpful to listeners. Thank you.
Oh, I know it has. That's it for today's episode. Do follow Emma on Twitter at Dr. Emma Katz, and make sure you grab a copy of her book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives. And I look forward to you joining me on my next episode.
That's it for today's episode of Heartbreak to Happiness. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to win a free ticket to one of Sarah's virtual retreats. The retreats are a transformative combination of live webinars with Sarah herself, coupled with empowering online video programs designed to help you cope better with your breakup and start feeling happy again. For more details, head on over to heartbreakttohappinesspodcast.com, where you can also get a copy of Sarah's free gift. Thank you, and join us again on the next episode for another dose of Heartbreak to Happiness.